The city hums with restless energy, neon lights flicker across wet cobblestones, saxophones wail through smoky doorways, and the shadow of a new empire stretches silently over New York. It's the early 1930s, prohibition is crumbling, speakeasies thrive behind every locked door, and money flows faster than morality can catch up. In the underbelly of this glittering chaos moves a man who will forever change the way the world understands organized crime. His name is Charles "Lucky" Luciano, the architect of the modern mafia, the man who took a world of gangs and bullets and transformed it into a system, an institution, a business built on fear and efficiency. Before Luciano, the criminal world was fractured, ruled by tradition, superstition, and brute power. After him, it became something else entirely, a machine of profit, structure, and diplomacy. He was no saint, but he was no ordinary gangster either. Luciano didn't merely run rackets. He reorganized the very foundation of the underworld, giving it rules, order, and hierarchy. He turned street thuggery into strategy, gambling into governance, and corruption into commerce. In a time when the American dream seemed just out of reach for millions of immigrants, he built his own dream, not on hard work or honesty but on intellect, ambition, and a ruthless sense of practicality. But this is not a story about a hero, nor is it a tale of simple evil. It's about power, its seduction, its structure, and its cost. It's about how a man born into poverty and prejudice could outthink the most powerful men in the city, politicians, businessmen, and cops alike. It's about how charm can be a weapon, loyalty a currency, and fear the foundation of an empire. And it's about how every system, no matter how strong, eventually begins to crack under the weight of its own ambition. Luciano's story begins in the immigrant neighborhoods of New York, where kids like him learned early that survival was a full-time job. He wasn't the biggest or the strongest, but he was observant. He watched people, how they talked, how they lied, how they wanted. Even as a teenager, Luciano understood that real power came not from violence, but from control. The kind of control that comes when everyone owes you something: money, favors, silence. This insight would define his life and shape the criminal world for generations. To understand Luciano, we have to understand his era. A time when the streets were both opportunity and prison. Prohibition had turned ordinary men into millionaires, gangsters into celebrities, and corruption into an accepted part of daily life. America was growing fast, and in the chaos of progress, the line between legality and crime blurred. Politicians dined with bootleggers, judges looked the other way, and the public adored the outlaws who lived larger than life. Into this intoxicating mix stepped a man who saw the future, not in chaos but in structure. As the camera pans through dimly lit alleyways and smoke-filled clubs, we glimpse the world Luciano would come to rule, a world without mercy but rich with opportunity. He moved among killers and businessmen, priests and politicians, knowing that all of them wanted the same thing: control. And where others used bullets, Luciano used balance, between loyalty and fear, chaos and order, greed and discipline. The name Lucky would come to symbolize more than survival. It would represent transformation. He survived knife attacks, betrayals, and the constant pull of the law. But luck alone wasn't what defined him. It was intelligence, cold, calculating intelligence, that allowed him to see patterns where others saw violence. Luciano understood systems, how people fit into them, how power flowed through them, and how they could be manipulated to serve his purpose. His legacy would outlive him, not because of the crimes he committed but because of the structure he built. The syndicates, the commissions, the codes of silence, all bore his signature. Even decades after his death, the shape of modern organized crime still echoes the mind of Lucky Luciano. But power never comes without a price. As the documentary's tone darkens, we foreshadow the forces that would one day turn against him: betrayal, ambition, and justice itself. Luciano's rise is not merely a tale of success, it's a study in human contradiction. The same instincts that made him great would ultimately destroy him. The same order he imposed on chaos would become the chain that dragged him down. And so, as the lights of New York shimmer against the black water of the Hudson, we begin our journey into the life of the man who turned crime into an institution. His story isn't just about gangsters and guns, it's about the psychology of control, the architecture of ambition, and the inevitable collapse of every empire built on fear. This is not just the story of Lucky Luciano. It is the story of how one man's vision changed the underworld, and how the underworld in turn changed America. Before Lucky Luciano ever rose to power, the world of organized crime in America was anything but organized. It was a battlefield, chaotic, divided, and ruled by tradition rather than intelligence. The early 1900s saw immigrant gangs carving out slivers of control in a country that didn't want them, where survival meant bending or breaking the rules. Each ethnic group had its own corner, its own codes, its own wars. The Irish controlled the docks and politics, the Jews ran gambling and the black markets, and the Italians, especially the Sicilians, operated in secret networks of loyalty and vengeance. There was no unity, no structure, and certainly no vision. Crime was personal, not professional. America itself was changing fast. Industrialization had packed millions of poor families into tenement housing, where hope was scarce and opportunity was often illegal. The police were corrupt, the politicians were bought, and in the shadows of this moral decay, a new breed of outlaw was emerging, men who saw vice not as sin but as business. Yet even among criminals there was a hierarchy. The old Sicilian bosses, men like Giuseppe Morello, the clutch hand, ruled through fear and tradition, invoking the codes of the old country. Their rule was medieval, loyalty bound by blood, punishment delivered without question. To them, America was not a new beginning, it was simply new territory to conquer. Then came Prohibition, the 18th Amendment, an era that transformed the underworld from petty gangs into vast empires overnight. When alcohol became illegal in 1920, the United States effectively handed organized crime its greatest business opportunity in history. Suddenly, every speakeasy, nightclub, and bar became a gold mine, and anyone who could supply liquor became a businessman, or a kingpin. It was a time when the word gangster entered the public imagination, and men like Al Capone became household names. Violence skyrocketed, but so did wealth. The streets ran red with blood, but the coffers of crime overflowed with cash. In New York, 5 powerful Italian factions dominated the landscape, each claiming territory, each enforcing its own brand of justice. The Morello family controlled Harlem, the Masuria clan ruled Lower Manhattan, Brooklyn was split between upstarts and old-timers. And within those borders no one trusted anyone. Assassinations were daily occurrences. Men disappeared as easily as they appeared. To cross another boss was to invite death, yet alliances shifted constantly. It was a time when even a simple handshake could be fatal. And yet, amid this chaos, the seeds of evolution were already being planted. The old bosses, bound by Sicilian tradition, distrusted outsiders, especially Jews and Irishmen. They believed in keeping business in the family, and they viewed innovation as weakness. But a younger generation was rising, one that saw crime as a modern enterprise rather than a feudal system. These young men had grown up in America, spoke English, and understood capitalism better than blood vendettas. Among them were names that would one day define an era. Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, Dutch Schultz, Frank Costello, and a sharp, calculating Sicilian named Charlie Luciano. While the older bosses operated with ritual and superstition, the new breed thought in terms of efficiency and profit. To them, killing a man wasn't about honor, it was about business. They saw alliances across ethnic lines not as betrayal but as opportunity. Luciano, still a small-time gangster in those years, was already thinking in these terms. He watched the old guard cling to power through paranoia while he envisioned a future built on partnership and planning. But for now the underworld was fractured. Every family, every faction, every street corner was a miniature kingdom with its own rules. The lack of organization made the Mafia vulnerable, not only to internal wars but to law enforcement. When one boss fell, his soldiers often turned on each other. The system was primitive, wasteful, and blood-soaked. The more powerful a man became, the more enemies he made, and the shorter his life expectancy grew. In the midst of this instability, there were visionaries who hinted at something greater. Johnny Torrio, mentor to Al Capone, was one of them. He treated crime like business, favoring deals over death, strategy over rage. Torrio's ideas would eventually influence Luciano, though the two operated in different cities. Torrio's rise and retirement after nearly being assassinated in Chicago showed the next generation that brains, not bullets, built longevity. Another key influence was Arnold Rothstein, the Jewish gambler and financial genius behind the 1919 World Series fix, the first true example of crime merging with corporate calculation. Rothstein saw vice as investment. Luciano would one day call him the teacher. Still, before such men could reshape the landscape, the old ways had to burn themselves out. The 1920s became a decade of gang wars and betrayals, culminating in a conflict so brutal it would come to define the very soul of the Mafia, the Castellammarese War. But before that storm erupted, the groundwork was being laid in every backroom and alleyway of New York. Ambition clashed with tradition. Youth challenged hierarchy. The underworld was evolving, though it didn't yet know it. And through all of this, one truth remained: power abhors disorder. The Mafia of the early 1920s was a beast without a brain, violent, profitable, but unsustainable. Luciano would become the man to change that, but not yet. He was still learning, still watching the chaos unfold, still waiting for the moment when the world would be desperate for order, even if that order came from a criminal. The city itself mirrored this duality. Above ground, the roaring 20s glittered with jazz, excess, and progress. Below, a different rhythm pulsed, one of secrecy, violence, and silent deals struck over glasses of contraband whiskey. The gangsters of this era were both entrepreneurs and executioners, symbols of the American dream gone rogue. They were building empires on greed, and America, in its own way, admired them for it. So when Charles Luciano finally began to rise, he wasn't just entering a world of crime. He was stepping into a void, a lawless space begging for leadership. The American Mafia before him was a house divided, one built on fear but lacking vision. What Luciano would do, what no one else dared to even imagine, was give this chaos structure. He would professionalize sin, corporatize violence, and bring efficiency to corruption. The world before Luciano was the wild frontier of the criminal age, untamed, unpredictable, and unsustainable. What would follow in his wake would be something far more dangerous. A system that didn't just commit crime but managed it, cleanly, strategically, invisibly. And it all began here, in the dark years before one man decided to turn the underworld into an institution. He was born Salvatore Lucania in 1897, in Lercara Fritti, Sicily, a land steeped in poverty, pride, and blood codes older than the country he would one day rule. His father, Antonio, was a laborer who believed in hard work and faith. His mother, Rosalia, was fiercely protective but weary of the violence that lingered like smoke over the Sicilian hills. For the Lucania family, America was a dream, a promise whispered across oceans, a place where poverty could be traded for possibility. In 1906, when Charlie was just 9 years old, they boarded a ship to New York City. What awaited them was not the land of opportunity, but a concrete jungle built on hunger and survival. The Lower East Side was a world apart, tenement buildings stacked like cages, streets teeming with pushcarts and pickpockets, and every block a mix of accents, tempers, and desperation. For young Luciano, this new life was a brutal education. His family barely survived on his father's meager wages, and school seemed irrelevant compared to the lessons the streets offered. Here, respect wasn't earned through honesty but through dominance. The kids who fought hardest got the best of everything: the food, the money, the fear. Charlie learned quickly that strength came not from fists but from the ability to control others. He started small, charging other boys for protection, running errands for petty criminals, always watching, always learning. The boy who once sat quietly in church was now absorbing the language of power. He studied people like a scientist, their habits, weaknesses, and ambitions. When he saw that the Irish boys had numbers and the Jewish kids had smarts, he realized the value of partnership across boundaries. The world told him to stay in his lane, but Charlie's instinct was to break every barrier he saw. By his teenage years, Luciano was running with small-time street gangs, dipping into theft and extortion. It was in these streets that he first crossed paths with two men who would change his life: Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. Lansky was quiet, cerebral, and mathematical, the thinker. Siegel was impulsive, ruthless, and magnetic, the enforcer. Together, they were the perfect triad of intellect, fear, and charisma. Luciano's partnership with them was revolutionary for its time. In a world still divided by ethnicity, they saw something beyond tribe or tradition: the shared pursuit of power. There's a story, almost mythic now, of how Luciano and Lansky first met. Luciano was shaking down Jewish kids for protection money when a small, wiry boy refused to pay. That boy was Meyer Lansky. Instead of fighting, Luciano was impressed. Lansky didn't flinch, didn't bluff. He had nerve, and Charlie respected nerve. It was a small encounter, but it built the foundation for one of the most powerful alliances in criminal history. In a world of bullets and betrayal, their friendship would be rooted in mutual calculation, a partnership that would one day shape the American underworld. As prohibition loomed, the city's underbelly began to pulse with new energy. Bootlegging operations were emerging, speakeasies were multiplying, and gangsters were evolving from local thugs into entrepreneurs. Luciano, still in his early 20s, was watching the transformation with hungry eyes. He was already earning a reputation, not for raw violence but for his ability to organize and negotiate. Other gangsters saw the world in blocks and borders. Luciano saw it like a chessboard. Every move was about leverage. Every alliance was an investment. he also learned from the best. In the 1910s he worked under Giuseppe Joe the Boss Mafia, one of the most feared mafia figures in New York. Mafia embodied the old-world mentality, loyalty through fear, leadership through intimidation. Luciano respected him but also recognized his limitations. The old guard operated on emotion. They killed for honor, not efficiency. Luciano preferred logic. Where Mafia saw enemies, he saw potential partners. That difference in worldview would one day split them apart, but for now Luciano bided his time. He learned the structure of the mafia from the inside, its hierarchy, rituals, and fatal weaknesses. Luck became part of his myth early on. In 1929, Luciano was kidnapped by rival gangsters, beaten, stabbed, and left for dead on Staten Island. He survived barely. His face was scarred for life, but the story made him a legend. From then on, everyone called him Lucky. But beneath the nickname lay something deeper, not luck but resilience. Luciano's near-death experience taught him something profound. Survival wasn't about fortune, it was about control. Never again would he let anyone else dictate the game. Through the 1920s, Luciano built his reputation as both a diplomat and an innovator. He cultivated ties with bootleggers, corrupt politicians, and businessmen alike. He was fluent in 2 languages, English and the language of money. When others boasted of loyalty, he spoke of profit. He didn't see himself as a criminal. He saw himself as an entrepreneur in an economy that refused him legitimacy. America's door was closed to men like him, so he built his own empire outside the law. Yet beneath the rising success, there was something colder forming in him, a belief that sentiment was weakness. Where other men sought glory, Luciano sought order. The gangs he moved among were loud, impulsive, and self-destructive. He was calculating, restrained, and obsessed with efficiency. He began forming small networks of trusted allies who shared his vision. Men like Frank Costello, the political fixer who could buy influence at City Hall, and Vito Genovese, the enforcer who could handle what Luciano couldn't afford to touch. Each man served a purpose in Luciano's emerging strategy: brains, money, muscle. By his mid-20s, Luciano was already earning a fortune. He wore tailored suits, smoked expensive cigars, and moved through nightclubs with a quiet authority. He wasn't the loudest man in the room, but everyone knew who he was. What set him apart wasn't fear but respect, a kind of silent power that drew people toward him. He understood psychology better than any mobster before him. He knew how to make men feel important, how to make them believe they were choosing to follow him. His genius wasn't just organization, it was manipulation. But Luciano's rise was happening in a world that still belonged to others. The Sicilian bosses still clung to the past, and they viewed his alliances with Jews and Irishmen as betrayal. They couldn't see what he saw, that the future of crime wasn't ethnic, it was economic. As the tension between old and new grew, Luciano stood on the edge of transformation. His street education was complete. His alliances were strong. His enemies were watching. He had learned everything the streets could teach him: how to survive, how to lead, and how to wait. Now he was ready to build something bigger than any gang, bigger than any family, a structure that would outlive them all. From the dirt of Mulberry Street to the penthouses of Manhattan, Lucky Luciano was about to become more than a man, he was about to become an institution. By the mid-1920s, Charles Lucky Luciano was no longer just another ambitious street hustler. He was a man on the verge of transformation. The years spent in the shadows had taught him that brute force would never be enough. He had seen too many gangsters rise fast and fall faster, men who mistook fear for respect and bloodshed for control. Luciano wanted something different. He wanted permanence. And to build that, he needed to learn from people who had already mastered the one thing most criminals never understood: business. That mentor came in the form of a man named Arnold Rothstein, known across New York as the Brain. Rothstein was not your typical gangster. He didn't carry a gun or bark orders in back alleys. He wore tailored suits, spoke softly, and operated from the luxury of midtown hotels. To him, crime wasn't chaos, it was commerce. He fixed the 1919 World Series, ran high-stakes gambling operations, and handled politicians the way other men handled dice. To Luciano, Rothstein was something close to a revelation, a man who proved that illegal money could buy legitimate power. Luciano's introduction to Rothstein came through the network of bootleggers who supplied the city's underground bars. Rothstein quickly saw potential in the young Sicilian: sharp eyes, quick tongue, and a dangerous kind of intelligence. He took Luciano under his wing, teaching him how to turn disorder into opportunity. "You don't need to be the one holding the gun," Rothstein allegedly told him. "You just need to be the one holding the purse." Those words would become Luciano's guiding philosophy. Rothstein taught Luciano the language of legitimacy, how to read balance sheets, how to structure deals, and how to make crime appear clean. Under his mentorship, Luciano began to see the Mafia not as a gang, but as a corporation. Every man was a department. Every racket was a revenue stream. Bootlegging, gambling, and prostitution weren't vices, they were markets. The challenge wasn't making money, it was making the system sustainable. Rothstein showed him that bribing a cop or politician wasn't corruption, it was cost of operations. He was learning to turn crime into infrastructure. This education coincided with the booming prohibition economy, which had transformed America into a land of contradictions. On the surface, the law forbade alcohol. In reality, liquor flowed more freely than ever, through hidden pipelines, rum-running ships, and secret speakeasies. The streets of New York were flooded with money, and everyone wanted a piece. The old Sicilian bosses demanded tribute through violence, but Rothstein's model, and now Luciano's, was subtler. Use intelligence over intimidation, influence over fear. Luciano began applying these principles immediately. Alongside partners like Frank Costello and Meyer Lansky, he streamlined bootlegging routes, ensured product consistency, and bribed officials to keep the flow uninterrupted. He started to think like a corporate executive, managing supply chains, quality control, and profit margins. The underworld had never seen this level of sophistication. But for all his education under Rothstein, Luciano still had to navigate the reality of the Mafia's rigid structure. At that time, New York's Italian underworld was dominated by Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masuria, an old-school don who believed loyalty came through fear and heritage. Masuria saw the Mafia as a family, not a business, and he ruled it with an iron hand. To him, outsiders were enemies and innovation was betrayal. Luciano, despite being his lieutenant, quietly disagreed with everything Masuria stood for. Masuria's leadership was a lesson in what not to do. He demanded tribute from every racket, yet offered no vision for growth. His obsession with old-world codes stifled expansion. Luciano saw this clearly and understood that the future of organized crime couldn't survive under the weight of nostalgia. "You can't build an empire on tradition," he once remarked privately. "You build it on money." As he rose in the ranks, Luciano used charm and diplomacy to expand his influence. He met regularly with Irish and Jewish figures like Lansky, Siegel, and Dutch Schultz, something no Sicilian boss would have dared. These meetings weren't just about alliances, they were about shaping a new model. Luciano envisioned a criminal network that mirrored American capitalism, multicultural, efficient, and profit-driven. He was creating the blueprint for what would later be called the National Crime Syndicate. But learning from Rothstein wasn't just about business mechanics, it was also about psychology. Rothstein taught him how to think 3 moves ahead, how to read people, and how to appear indispensable without showing emotion. Luciano began cultivating an image, calm, confident, and untouchable. Where others blustered, he stayed silent. Where others threatened, he negotiated. He understood that true power didn't shout, it whispered. When Rothstein was murdered in 1928, Luciano lost more than a mentor. He lost the man who had taught him to think like an empire builder. But rather than retreat, he doubled down. Rothstein's death left a vacuum in the underworld's upper echelons, one Luciano was perfectly positioned to fill. He inherited not only Rothstein's lessons but many of his contacts, politicians, bankers, and union men who could turn dirty money into clean influence. Luciano was now operating on 2 levels, the visible world of street rackets and the invisible network of financial control. Meanwhile, tensions in the Italian underworld were reaching a breaking point. Joe Masuria's arrogance had created enemies everywhere, particularly among Sicilian immigrants from the coastal town of Castellamare del Golfo, who had brought with them their own leader, Salvatore Maranzano. Maranzano represented the pure Sicilian code, the old country way, a rigid hierarchical order obsessed with bloodlines and honor. To him, Luciano's alliances with Jews and Irishmen were an unforgivable betrayal of tradition. What neither man realized was that Luciano was learning from both. From Rothstein he absorbed modernity, from Masuria and Maranzano he studied tradition, only to one day use both against them. He saw clearly what they could not, that the Mafia was caught in its own civil war between the past and the future. Through the late 1920s, Luciano's operations flourished. His network spanned gambling dens, speakeasies, and prostitution rings from Harlem to Manhattan. He wasn't just earning money, he was accumulating leverage. Judges, cops, and local politicians were already on his payroll. He had built a quiet empire beneath the radar, and every move was preparing him for the inevitable war that would define his destiny. When he looked at Masuria and Maranzano, he saw relics, powerful, yes, but blind to the world that was coming. America was changing. The Mafia had to change with it. Luciano would be the one to force that evolution no matter the cost. By 1929 he stood at the crossroads of two worlds, the old Mafia, bound by tradition and pride, and the new order, driven by commerce and power. He had the intelligence of Rothstein, the discipline of Masuria, and the vision neither could comprehend. All he needed now was the right moment to break free, to shatter the chains of the past and replace them with the machinery of the future. In the coming years that moment would arrive, drenched in blood and betrayal. But for now, Lucky Luciano was still learning, not just how to make money but how to build an empire that could never die. By 1930, the streets of New York were boiling. Prohibition had made millionaires out of gangsters, but it had also turned the underworld into a powder keg. The Italian mob, divided between rival bosses, had become a theater of blood. Everyone wanted to rule but no one could unify. The result was a silent, creeping war that would soon erupt into one of the most violent conflicts in Mafia history, the Castellamarese War. And in the middle of it all stood Lucky Luciano, a man who understood that to create order, chaos sometimes had to run its course. The war's origins lay in a simple but fatal division: Old World versus New World. On one side stood Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masuria, a swaggering old-school don who saw himself as the supreme ruler of the American Mafia. He believed in loyalty, fear, and tribute, the three pillars of Sicilian control. To him, Luciano was a protégé, a rising star to be shaped in his image. On the other side was Salvatore Maranzano, a Castellamarese from Sicily's western coast, who brought with him a strict, almost religious devotion to Mafia hierarchy. To Maranzano, Masuria was corrupt and undisciplined, a man who had let American greed pollute Sicilian honor. But beneath these cultural differences was something deeper: power. Both men wanted to rule the Italian underworld, and both believed there could only be one king. Their soldiers and lieutenants were soon dragged into the conflict, transforming New York into a chessboard of blood. Restaurants, bars, and even homes became killing grounds. Gunfire echoed through Brooklyn and the Bronx. Men vanished, their bodies discovered days later in alleyways or floating in the Hudson. For Luciano, the war was both a threat and an opportunity. He was officially one of Masuria's top lieutenants, running key rackets and managing alliances. But privately he was disgusted by the senselessness of it all. Masuria's methods, demanding blind loyalty and responding to every slight with murder, were ruining business. The killings drew attention, scared partners, and disrupted profits. Luciano began to see the conflict not as a matter of honor but as a failure of leadership. And in that failure he saw his path to power. He kept his cards close. To Masuria, Luciano remained the loyal soldier, executing orders and maintaining operations. To Maranzano's men he was a potential ally, a modern thinker trapped under an old boss. Luciano's brilliance was his ability to play both sides without revealing his hand. He understood that in a war of egos the patient man becomes king. The Castellamarese War dragged on for nearly 2 years, leaving bodies and betrayals in its wake. Capos switched sides, alliances crumbled overnight. The violence grew so out of control that even other ethnic gangs, Irish, Jewish, and Polish outfits, began to avoid doing business with the Italians. They were animals, one bootlegger would later recall. Every day somebody got clipped. You didn't even ask who anymore. During this time, Luciano began quietly consolidating power among the younger, more pragmatic generation. He held secret meetings with Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, and others who shared his vision of a modernized underworld. They agreed that the war was destroying everything they had built during Prohibition. What they needed wasn't another boss, it was a system. A way to manage crime like a business instead of a family feud. But first the old bosses had to go. In 1931, Luciano made his move. According to underworld legend, he set up a truce meeting between himself, Masuria, and Maranzano, but behind the scenes he was preparing the ultimate betrayal. Luciano lured Joe Masuria to a restaurant on Coney Island under the guise of peace talks. They played cards, drank wine, and laughed as if the war were finally over. Then Luciano excused himself, went to the bathroom, and as soon as he left the room, gunmen burst in. When Luciano returned, Joe the Boss lay slumped over the table, a deck of cards scattered across the blood-stained cloth. The old guard was dead. The murder sent shockwaves through the underworld. Some called Luciano a traitor. Others called him a genius. For him it was neither personal nor moral, it was strategic. "You can't make peace with a man who doesn't understand it," he once told an associate. To Luciano, killing Masuria wasn't a betrayal, it was a necessary step toward building something new. But peace was short-lived. With Masuria gone, Maranzano declared himself the undisputed boss of all bosses, capo di tutti capi. He reorganized the Mafia into 5 New York families, establishing ranks like capo regime and soldato. Ironically, the system he created was a precursor to the very commission Luciano would later form, but under Maranzano, it was rigid and dictatorial. He enforced the old Sicilian rules: only full-blooded Italians could lead, and loyalty to him was absolute. He saw himself as Julius Caesar reborn, even comparing his lieutenants to Roman senators. To Luciano, this was just another kind of tyranny. Maranzano's obsession with tradition made him paranoid and brittle. He distrusted Luciano's friendship with Jewish partners like Lansky and Siegel. Rumors spread that Maranzano planned to eliminate Luciano and his allies, to purify the Mafia. Luciano heard the whispers and understood that history was repeating itself. Once again he was working under a man too blind to see the world changing. This time he wouldn't wait. In September 1931, Luciano struck again. Using his Jewish associates, gunmen unknown to Maranzano's men, he orchestrated the assassination of Salvatore Maranzano in his own office. The killers, posing as government agents, stormed the building, disarmed his guards, and gunned him down. The old world died that day, not just the man but the mentality. The Castellammarese War ended, and the modern Mafia was born. Luciano didn't celebrate, he calculated. With both Masuria and Maranzano gone, there was no single ruler left to claim the throne. He deliberately refused to become another boss of bosses. Instead, he proposed something revolutionary: a council of equals. No one man would rule over all. The Mafia would function like a federation, each family sovereign but bound by mutual respect and profit. It was a concept inspired by American democracy and American capitalism. The Castellammarese War had cost hundreds of lives, but from its ashes, Luciano forged something enduring. He had proven that intellect could triumph over tradition, that control was more powerful than chaos. Where others saw war, Luciano saw evolution. Yet, deep down he knew what the war had really taught him: that power in the underworld could never be shared for long, and that every alliance was temporary. The Mafia could be organized, yes, but it could never be trusted. Still, he had learned the lesson that would define his legacy: if you want to end the bloodshed, you have to become the man who decides when it starts. The Castellammarese War was more than a fight for control. It was the dividing line between the Mafia's past and its future, between the codes of Sicily and the capitalism of America. And standing at that crossroads, lucky Luciano didn't just survive history. He rewrote it. When the smoke of the Castellammarese War finally cleared, a new order emerged, one built not on blood oaths and vendettas but on structure, discipline, and business. Lucky Luciano had not only survived the chaos, he had transformed it. The streets that once echoed with gunfire now hummed with quiet, calculated profit. For the first time in the history of organized crime, there was peace, but it wasn't the peace of saints. It was the peace of businessmen. Luciano's vision was unlike anything the Mafia had ever seen. To him, the old ways were relics of a dying generation. The Sicilian bosses who once ruled through fear and superstition were gone, replaced by men who understood balance sheets as well as bullets. He saw the Mafia not as a family but as an institution, a network of enterprises united by profit, not heritage. "You can't run crime like a religion," he supposedly told Frank Costello. "You run it like a business, and you don't mix business with revenge." At the center of this new structure was the Commission, Luciano's greatest innovation. Modeled loosely after a corporate board of directors, the Commission was designed to prevent wars and maintain order among the families. Each of New York's 5 families, Luciano's own, the Mangano, Bonanno, Professai, and Gagliano families, would have representation. They would meet, vote on disputes, and make decisions collectively. No single boss could dictate terms. No man could claim to be capo di tutti capi. It was revolutionary, a democratic Mafia. But make no mistake, Luciano was no idealist. The Commission gave the illusion of equality, yet everyone knew who really pulled the strings. Luciano remained the quiet architect behind every major decision. His charm and intelligence made him the natural mediator, the man everyone trusted, or feared, to keep the machine running. He believed in diplomacy, but he also understood leverage. If a family stepped out of line, their rackets would be cut off, their unions turned against them, or their enemies quietly empowered. Control through consensus, that was Luciano's genius. The next step was to turn the Mafia's scattered rackets into an organized, reliable revenue system. Prohibition had made millions for bootleggers, but with the 18th Amendment's repeal in 1933, the easy money was drying up. Luciano pivoted fast. If alcohol was no longer illegal, there were plenty of other vices that would never go out of demand: gambling, prostitution, narcotics, and labor racketeering. Gambling was the cornerstone. Illegal betting, horse racing, and underground casinos brought steady, low-risk income. With Meyer Lansky as his financial strategist, Luciano expanded operations across the country, from New York to Florida, from Chicago to Havana. They funneled profits through legitimate businesses: hotels, restaurants, construction companies. Lansky's financial wizardry and Luciano's political connections created a system so complex that even federal agents couldn't trace the money. Then came prostitution, a darker, riskier empire. Luciano saw the city's sex trade as disorganized and exploitable. He applied his business model to it, creating what authorities later called the biggest prostitution ring in American history. Under the control of his lieutenant, Cokie Flo Brown, Luciano's syndicate ran hundreds of brothels, each paying a percentage to the organization. The women, many of them immigrants, worked under brutal conditions, but to Luciano, it was simply another enterprise. The profits poured in, an estimated $12 million a year by some accounts. Yet for all his ruthlessness, Luciano's mind remained on the long game. He knew that power depended on legitimacy, or at least the illusion of it. That's where Frank Costello, his suave and politically connected partner, came in. Costello's job was to make the underworld respectable. He funneled Mafia money into Tammany Hall politicians, secured police protection, and used union power to control contracts across industries. With Costello's influence, Luciano's empire was virtually untouchable. But Luciano wasn't just a street boss, he was a visionary. He saw America changing, becoming urban, industrial, interconnected, and he adapted the Mafia to fit that landscape. He formed alliances across ethnic lines, something no Sicilian boss had ever dared. Jews like Lansky and Siegel, Irish gangsters like Auntie Madden, they were all part of his network. It wasn't about bloodlines anymore, it was about brains. The only color that matters, he once quipped, is green. To the outside world, Luciano's empire looked invisible. There were no headlines about wars or assassinations. The Mafia was quiet, smooth, organized, its tendrils woven into the fabric of American business. But beneath the surface, the psychology of control still ruled. Luciano believed that loyalty was bought, not inherited. He rewarded efficiency, punished disobedience, and kept everyone dependent on his goodwill. He understood something most bosses never did: fear keeps men in line, but respect keeps them working. This era, roughly from 1931 to 1935, was Luciano's golden age. He moved through Manhattan like a shadow monarch, untouchable and admired. Politicians toasted him at parties without realizing who he was. His name was whispered, never spoken aloud. In his suite at the Waldorf Astoria, Luciano conducted business like a corporate executive. Tailored suits, manicured nails, the scent of expensive cigars drifting through the room. He wasn't a gangster anymore. He was an institution. But beneath the polish, there was rot forming, the inevitable decay that comes when a man believes himself invincible. The same system Luciano built to bring peace also made enemies of those who craved absolute power. Some old-school bosses resented his partnerships with Jews and outsiders. Others whispered that he had broken the sacred omerta by modernizing too much. And then there were the women. The brothels that made him rich also exposed him to betrayal, jealousy, and attention from the law. Still, for now, Lucky Luciano was untouchable. The five families operated like clockwork. The commission resolved disputes without bloodshed. Money flowed, and the Mafia reached into every corner of American life, from construction unions to nightclubs, from dockyards to City Hall. Luciano's success was more than criminal. It was psychological. He had proven that power didn't have to shout, it could whisper. Control didn't require chaos, it could thrive in order. The Mafia was no longer a shadowy collection of thugs. Under his rule, it became a parallel society, structured, predictable, and terrifyingly efficient. And yet, deep within Luciano there was an awareness, a flicker of unease. He knew that every empire built on crime eventually invites scrutiny. He knew that peace never lasts forever. But for the time being, the man who had once survived gang wars and betrayals now sat at the top of the American underworld. He had done what no one before him could. He had turned crime into an institution. The Mafia under Lucky Luciano's leadership might have looked like a well-oiled empire, but beneath its polished surface lay a web of alliances and rivalries that could unravel at any moment. Power never truly rested, it shifted, flowed, and turned on whispers. And in Luciano's world, every friendship carried a knife in its shadow. By the mid-1930s, Luciano's grip on the American underworld was near absolute. Yet even he understood that holding power was harder than taking it. The Mafia was now an empire of personalities, ambitious, unpredictable, and dangerous men whose loyalty was measured in profit, not promises. Keeping them united required constant negotiation, psychological insight, and, when necessary, ruthless enforcement. At the center of this complex web were Luciano's closest allies, men who reflected different sides of his own nature. Frank Costello, the prime minister, was his diplomat. Smooth, urbane, and calculating, Costello understood politics the way Luciano understood power. He navigated City Hall and the police department, ensuring the Mafia's protection through bribery and charm rather than bullets. To the public he was respectable, to the underworld he was indispensable. Together, Luciano and Costello created a network so deep within New York's infrastructure that even law enforcement unknowingly worked for them. Then there was Meyer Lansky, the financial brain. Lansky wasn't Italian, a fact that would have made him a liability in the old Mafia, but Luciano didn't care. Their friendship, forged in the street wars of the Lower East Side, had evolved into a partnership that changed organized crime forever. Lansky handled money like an artist. Clean, efficient, invisible. He turned gambling profits into offshore investments, legitimized funds through Havana casinos, and built connections in Cuba and Las Vegas that would later define the Mafia's global reach. Luciano trusted him completely, perhaps more than any other man. But trust in the Mafia was always conditional. Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, another ally from Luciano's early days, represented the volatile side of the empire, all flash, charm, and danger. Siegel was fearless, loyal to Lansky and Luciano, but impulsive. He moved to Los Angeles to expand the syndicate's reach into Hollywood, muscling into movie studios, narcotics, and gambling. Siegel's glamour and recklessness made him both an asset and a liability. To Luciano, Bugsy was a reminder that the modern mobster could be both a businessman and a celebrity, but one wrong move could make either persona collapse. Beyond his circle of trusted lieutenants, however, were rivals. Men who tolerated Luciano's leadership but never forgot that he had killed their mentors. Among them were Joe Bonanno, Vincent Mangano, and Tommy Gagliano, heads of the other New York families. On the surface, they played by Luciano's rules, attending commission meetings and dividing profits. But beneath the table, each man built his own networks, his own silent ambitions. Joe Bonanno, in particular, represented a clash of philosophies. Traditional, secretive, and fiercely loyal to Sicilian roots, Bonanno believed Luciano's alliances with Jews and Irish were a betrayal of the Mafia's identity. He saw the commission as a dilution of power, a way to weaken tradition and invite outsiders into sacred business. Bonanno's resentment simmered quietly, but Luciano knew it was there, waiting for a moment of weakness to surface. Rivalries weren't limited to the Italians. The Jewish syndicate, though allies, also had its fractures. Arnold Rothstein, the man who first taught Luciano and Lansky the business side of crime, had long been dead, but his legacy lived on in the complex web of partnerships between Italian and Jewish gangsters. Each alliance came with tension. The Italians controlled the streets, but the Jews controlled the money. It was a balance that worked, but only because Luciano understood both worlds. Still, cracks began to show. The more organized Luciano made the Mafia, the more attention it attracted. Prohibition was over, but the rackets, gambling, prostitution, narcotics, kept growing. Politicians who once turned a blind eye began to feel the heat of public scrutiny. Newspapers whispered about a national crime syndicate, a mysterious cabal that ran everything from New York to Chicago. And at the center of every rumor was one name, Lucky Luciano. For the first time, he faced pressure not from rival gangs but from law enforcement. Thomas E. Dewey, a young and ambitious prosecutor, had begun to rise in New York politics. Dewey saw the Mafia not as folklore but as a disease, and Luciano as its beating heart. His investigations into organized crime began targeting Luciano's associates, particularly the prostitution ring that had made him millions. Luciano laughed it off at first. To him, Dewey was just another crusader, another man chasing headlines. But he underestimated the prosecutor's persistence, and his ego. Inside the organization, the whispers grew louder. Some bosses wondered if Luciano's fame had become a liability. Others worried that his empire had become too large, too visible. The same traits that made him revolutionary, his openness, his alliances, his cosmopolitan image, were now vulnerabilities. A single betrayal could bring the entire structure down. And betrayals were always close. One of the first cracks came from within his own network of women, the madams and prostitutes who ran his brothels. They were the invisible workforce behind his wealth, and they began to talk. Detectives, posing as clients, gathered names, addresses, and payoffs. Dewey's men followed the trail, connecting everything back to Luciano. Suddenly, the very system that had made him powerful became the weapon used to destroy him. Still, Luciano's psychology during this period remained fascinating. He didn't panic, he adapted. He began delegating more, insulating himself from operations and focusing on appearances. He continued attending social events, dressed in fine suits, confident and untouchable. He believed his network of loyalty and influence would protect him, that the system he built was too vast for any single man, even Dewey, to break. But beneath that confidence, the air was shifting. The alliances he had nurtured began to strain under pressure. Friends became cautious. Associates became distant. And rivals, both inside and outside the commission, began to see opportunity. To the world, Lucky Luciano was still the king of organized crime, refined, untouchable, a man who had made chaos bow to logic. But within his empire, the balance was changing. Power built on fear and respect can hold, until one trembles and the other fades. Luciano didn't know it yet, but his greatest enemy wasn't a rival boss or an assassin. It was the very system he had built, a machine so intricate that, when turned against him, it would leave him defenseless. The age of alliances had given him control. But soon, those same connections would pull him toward his fall. By 1935, Lucky Luciano's empire stood at its zenith, sleek, disciplined, and profitable beyond measure. The Mafia had become more than an underworld network. It was an invisible government. Its tendrils reached into labor unions, politics, nightclubs, and shipping docks. Every dollar that moved through New York seemed to brush against Luciano's influence. Yet as he rose higher, the shadows around him deepened. What Luciano couldn't see, or refused to, was that his meticulously built system had begun to attract the one kind of enemy he couldn't outwit with charm or bullets: the government. The hidden war had begun. This wasn't a war fought with Tommy guns and ambushes. It was a battle of investigations, indictments, and surveillance, fought in offices, courtrooms, and newspaper headlines. The new crusader leading the charge was Thomas E. Dewey, the ambitious special prosecutor whose name would soon become synonymous with the crusade against organized crime. Dewey was everything Luciano wasn't: rigid, moralistic, relentless. Where Luciano saw crime as business, Dewey saw it as infection. And his mission was purification. Dewey began methodically. He didn't go after Luciano directly at first. He went after the edges, the brothels, the pimps, the bookkeepers. The prostitution network that Luciano had treated as a small side business turned out to be the perfect thread to pull. Detectives raided one brothel after another, arresting women who had long been invisible to the system. Under questioning, and often brutal intimidation, they began to talk. Names surfaced, connections were drawn, and soon the investigators saw a pattern. All trails led back to the same headquarters, Luciano's empire. The irony was cruel. Luciano, who had once prided himself on being a modern businessman, was now exposed by the very structure he had built. His centralized control, which had made the Mafia efficient, also made it traceable. Paper trails, payments, and coded communications began to piece together the outlines of a vast organization. To Dewey, this was no longer rumor or myth. It was proof that organized crime operated like a corporation, with Lucky Luciano as its CEO. At first, Luciano dismissed the threat. He had survived wars, assassins, and rival bosses. A prosecutor was just another name in the paper. He was still living in luxury at the Waldorf Astoria, dining with politicians, and running his empire through coded phone calls and hand signals. His lieutenants warned him to lay low, but Luciano laughed. "I'm too smart to get caught," he told one associate. But Dewey was relentless. He turned the investigation into a moral crusade, using the media to paint Luciano as the embodiment of corruption. Headlines screamed of a vice king ruling over New York's flesh trade. The image infuriated Luciano, not just because it was dangerous but because it felt insulting. In his mind, prostitution was beneath his level. "I don't pimp," he reportedly said. "I run an organization." But public perception didn't care about nuance. To the people, he was the face of organized sin. Behind the scenes, however, the real war was psychological. Luciano's world, built on loyalty, fear and silence, began to tremble. The police raids created panic among his lower ranks. Some madams and prostitutes flipped, offering testimony in exchange for leniency. One name in particular, Cokie Flo Brown, a woman who had worked directly under Luciano's operation, became a star witness. Her testimony placed him directly at the top of the prostitution network. It didn't matter that Luciano rarely dealt with her personally. Her story painted him as the mastermind, the puppet master pulling the strings. As Dewey's case grew, Luciano's allies began to falter. Some wanted him to flee. Others whispered that he should pay off the prosecutor or worse, eliminate him. But Luciano refused. Killing Dewey, he knew, would turn him from a criminal into a martyr for law and order. He believed he could outmaneuver him as he had outmaneuvered every enemy before. Still, the walls were closing in. Dewey assembled a case with precision. He traced payments through front businesses, uncovered secret communications, and built a narrative of systemic exploitation. Even though the evidence was circumstantial, Dewey understood something Luciano didn't. Trials were not just about facts, they were about theater. In the court of public opinion, Lucky Luciano was already guilty. The hidden war wasn't just fought in New York. Across the country, federal agencies began taking notice. J. Edgar Hoover, long resistant to acknowledging the Mafia's existence, began quietly gathering intelligence. Reports of national criminal syndicates started circulating within government departments. Luciano's name appeared again and again, alongside those of Lansky, Siegel, and Costello. The syndicate that had once thrived in secrecy was now under a microscope. Meanwhile, inside the underworld, unease spread. Rival bosses, Bonanno, Mangano, and others, began to sense weakness. They remained outwardly loyal to Luciano, but his growing notoriety threatened the entire system. If Dewey brought him down, the commission itself could crumble. For the first time since the end of the Castellamarese War, whispers of betrayal resurfaced. Maybe it's time for new leadership, some said quietly. Others waited to see if Luciano could survive. Luciano's response was pure calculation. He doubled down on diplomacy. He reassured his allies, sent gifts to rivals, and reminded everyone that stability meant profit. In private, however, he began preparing for the worst. He transferred assets, restructured leadership, and distanced himself from street-level operations. But it was too late. Dewey's machine was unstoppable now. In early 1936, Dewey struck. He announced formal charges against Lucky Luciano, not for murder, extortion, or bootlegging, but for compulsory prostitution, a legal term that tied him directly to the city's vast sex racket. The indictment shocked the underworld. For all their crimes, no major mafia boss had ever been successfully prosecuted at that level. Luciano's arrest was cinematic. Federal agents tracked him to Hot Springs, Arkansas, where he had fled for a brief getaway. Surrounded in a hotel suite, he was arrested without resistance. Elegant, calm, dressed immaculately as though attending a business meeting. When asked if he had anything to say, he smirked and replied, "They'll never make it stick." But as he was escorted back to New York under heavy guard, a different kind of battle was beginning, one he couldn't fight with his usual weapons. The newspapers portrayed him as the criminal king of America. The moral outrage was nationwide. For Dewey, this wasn't just an arrest, it was a message. The age of invincible gangsters was over. In truth, though, the war was far from finished. Luciano still had his network, his influence, his reputation. He believed that even behind bars he could outplay the system, that the Mafia's reach was longer than the laws. But Dewey's campaign had exposed something deeper, that even the most sophisticated criminal empire could be undone not by violence, but by visibility. The hidden war had stripped Luciano of his greatest weapon, anonymity. For years he had ruled from the shadows, unseen but omnipresent. Now, every newspaper in America printed his name, his photo, his crimes. The man who had turned crime into a business had, unintentionally, made himself its brand. And that brand was about to be destroyed. The old wars had been fought with guns. This one was fought with headlines and handcuffs. And for the first time, Lucky Luciano, the man who had tamed chaos, was the hunted, not the hunter. The year 1936 marked the beginning of the end for Charles Lucky Luciano, the man who had built an empire on charm, cunning, and control. For over a decade, he had walked untouched through the flames of gang wars, political corruption, and the volatile underworld of New York City. But now the flames were at his feet. The prosecutor Thomas E. Dewey had done the unthinkable. He had dragged the invisible king of organized crime into the public square. And as Luciano was led into the Manhattan Criminal Courts building, surrounded by flashing cameras and federal marshals, he knew one thing with chilling certainty: this war would not be won with bullets. It would be fought with words, witnesses, and fear. The fall began not with a gunshot, but with testimony, fragile, wavering voices that Dewey weaponized like knives. The state's case against Luciano was built largely on the words of women, prostitutes, madams, and informants who painted him as the architect of an empire built on exploitation. They described payoffs, coded orders, and nightly collections. One woman said Luciano's lieutenants threatened to burn her face off if she didn't cooperate. Another claimed she had seen him in person, the boss of bosses himself, overseeing the operation like a corporate CEO. Luciano's defense scoffed. "He's a businessman," his lawyer said, "not a pimp." But Dewey's brilliance was his ability to transform accusation into narrative. He didn't have to prove Luciano's direct involvement, only that he had created a system where such crimes thrived. Every witness, every headline, every photograph chipped away at Luciano's carefully constructed image of sophistication. The man who once dined with politicians was now portrayed as the nation's most corrupt parasite. The courtroom became a stage and Dewey its director. Reporters filled the gallery, scribbling every glance, every whisper. The women who testified were presented as victims of a vast machine, Luciano's machine. Dewey's rhetoric was almost theatrical. "This man has profited from the degradation of women, from the misery of our city's streets." It didn't matter that most of the witnesses were unreliable, or that some had been coached. To the jury, Dewey was the face of moral justice. Luciano sat silently through most of it, impeccably dressed in tailored suits, a cigarette always between his fingers. To the jury he looked unbothered, confident, even arrogant. But inside he was calculating. Every witness who took the stand was a reminder of how far his reach had extended, and how carelessly he had assumed no one would ever turn on him. The Mafia code of omerta, silence, had been broken not by gangsters, but by those society had ignored: women, the powerless, the discarded. Behind the courtroom walls, another kind of battle raged, the psychological one. Dewey knew that breaking Luciano's composure was key. He wanted to make the untouchable man appear human, vulnerable, desperate. He ordered surprise raids on Luciano's associates mid-trial, leaked stories to the press, and even hinted that Luciano's friends were cooperating. It was all part of a strategy to make him feel cornered. But Luciano was no ordinary defendant. His mind was a fortress. To him, the courtroom was just another kind of battlefield, one that demanded patience instead of bullets. He refused to testify, refused to plead, and refused to acknowledge guilt. "They can't prove what they can't see," he told his lawyer. And he was partly right. There was no written order, no photograph, no clear evidence linking him directly to the crimes. What Dewey had built was a circumstantial masterpiece, a case held together by psychology, not proof. The turning point came when Dewey presented a single, devastating argument: control implies responsibility. Luciano's influence was so absolute, so pervasive, that even if he hadn't personally managed the brothels, he had allowed them to exist under his reign. The logic was elegant and lethal. It reframed the trial from one about specific crimes to one about moral authority. In Dewey's narrative, Lucky Luciano wasn't just guilty of running a racket. He was guilty of being Lucky Luciano. The jury deliberated for 9 hours. When they returned, the courtroom fell silent. The foreman read the verdict: guilty on all counts. Luciano, who had survived bullets, betrayals, and wars, didn't flinch. He simply nodded, lit a cigarette, and looked at Dewey with cold detachment. His sentence: 30 to 50 years in state prison. The reaction outside was electric. The newspapers declared victory. Headlines screamed, "Vice King falls," and "Luciano sentenced, end of the Mafia era." For Thomas Dewey, it was a career-defining triumph, a springboard to political stardom. For Luciano, it was humiliation on a scale he had never imagined. But the truth was more complicated. Inside the Mafia, reactions were mixed. Some bosses rejoiced quietly: one rival was gone and the balance of power could shift again. Others mourned the loss of a stabilizing figure. Luciano had kept the peace, kept money flowing, kept the commission functional. Without him, there was fear of chaos. Luciano was transferred to Clinton Correctional Facility, better known as Dannemora, a fortress in upstate New York that locals called Little Siberia. For a man used to silk suits and private dinners, the gray walls of the prison were suffocating. Yet even there he adapted. Prison, to Luciano, was just another environment to control. Within months he began to exert influence over guards, inmates, and even the prison economy. Cigarettes, favors, and connections replaced weapons and rackets. The code of power remained the same: find leverage, use it. But the isolation gnawed at him. For the first time in his life he wasn't in motion. He wasn't orchestrating, commanding, or manipulating. He was simply waiting, and that was the one thing Lucky Luciano had never learned to do. In the stillness of his cell he began to reflect. How had it come to this? How had a boy from the slums of Sicily, a survivor of gang wars and assassinations, ended up in a cold steel cage because of a few whispers from women he barely knew? The answer was painful but clear. He had made himself too visible. The very modernization of the Mafia, the structure, the commission, the national networks, had drawn attention that secrecy once protected them from. Luciano's brilliance had created a new kind of empire, but it had also made him its most recognizable face. And recognition was death in his world. In his letters he maintained his defiance. He insisted he had been framed, that Dewey's case was a political show trial. But privately he knew the real reason he was behind bars. He had believed his own myth. He had thought himself untouchable. Outside the prison the underworld began to shift. Frank Costello stepped up as the acting boss, keeping Luciano's interests alive. Meyer Lansky maintained the financial networks, ensuring the money kept flowing. The commission continued to operate, cautiously, quietly, as if its leader was merely on an extended vacation. And in a way he still was. Because even from behind bars, Lucky Luciano was far from finished. His empire had survived bullets. Now it would have to survive his absence. The trial of Lucky Luciano was over, but the spectacle had only just begun. The verdict had sent shockwaves through both the criminal underworld and the political elite of New York. Newspapers couldn't print headlines fast enough. Luciano found guilty, Vice King gets 50 years. Dewey was hailed as a modern-day crusader, the man who had finally brought down the boss of bosses. For a city weary of corruption and vice, Luciano's conviction felt like justice restored. But for those who truly understood power, it was something else entirely: the end of an era. When Judge Philip J. McCook read the sentence, 30 to 50 years at Clinton Correctional Facility, the courtroom was silent. Luciano, dressed impeccably as always, showed no reaction. No anger. No fear. Just a faint, ironic smile, as if he were watching someone else's downfall. In that moment he understood something that few men ever do. Power isn't lost in a single instant. It's surrendered piece by piece until you realize you're no longer in control. Thomas E. Dewey, meanwhile, stood triumphant. To the public he was the man who had ripped the mask off organized crime. But to insiders, it was a political masterstroke. Dewey's case had been built not on ironclad evidence but on moral theater. He had crafted a narrative powerful enough to turn a jury, and the entire city, against Luciano. The courtroom had become a pulpit, and Dewey its preacher, turning the Vice case into a story of virtue versus corruption. Outside, camera bulbs flashed as Luciano was led away in handcuffs. Women wept. Men stared in disbelief. Even his enemies couldn't help but feel a flicker of admiration. The man who had ruled with such confidence, who had controlled everything from the shadows, now stood exposed under the harsh light of justice. Reporters shouted questions, but Luciano remained silent. Silence, after all, had always been his weapon. As the prison van carried him north toward Dannemora, the streets of New York seemed to shift. The city that had once moved to his rhythm, the rackets, the gambling dens, the union kickbacks, suddenly felt leaderless. The commission, the governing council he had created to bring order to the underworld, was still intact, but it lacked his vision. Luciano had been more than a boss. He had been the glue that held the criminal world together. Without him, alliances began to tremble. Back inside the courtroom, Dewey gave his final press statement. Today the law has proven that no man, no matter how powerful, is above justice. It was a clean, noble ending for him, but the truth was far murkier. Dewey had built his case on witnesses drawn from the city's shadows, prostitutes and madams terrified and coerced. Some were paid, others promised immunity. The testimony was inconsistent, often contradictory. Yet it didn't matter. The story had already taken root in the public imagination. Lucky Luciano, the criminal genius, had finally been defeated. In the weeks that followed, Luciano's name dominated the headlines. Some called him a monster. Others a martyr. For the immigrant communities that had once seen him as a symbol of power and success, his downfall was personal, a reminder of how fragile their place in America still was. The same country that celebrated its gangsters in films and headlines had now caged the real thing. From his cell, Luciano followed the news with a kind of detached curiosity. He knew Dewey had outplayed him, not in violence or intellect but in visibility. Dewey had used the public's hunger for justice as a weapon. He had made the trial not just about crime but about morality, about the soul of America. Luciano understood too late that his greatest strength, turning crime into an institution, had also been his undoing. He had professionalized vice, made it efficient, organized, predictable. In doing so he had drawn the attention of men like Dewey, who saw in him not just a criminal, but a symbol to destroy. The trial had also set a precedent. No longer could the Mafia rely solely on secrecy. The system had changed. The state had learned how to wage psychological war, through narratives, witnesses, and media. And in that sense, Dewey's victory wasn't just over Luciano. It was over the very concept of untouchable power. Still, Luciano's legend only grew. Even behind bars, his myth expanded. The papers called him the Silent Don, the Caged King. The public, paradoxically, loved him more than ever. There was something magnetic about his composure, his refusal to bend, to beg, to explain. He had lost the trial, yes, but he had not lost his aura. To many, Dewey had imprisoned a man, to others he had created a myth. And so, as the courtroom emptied and Dewey basked in political glory, the true story was still unfolding, not in the papers or the governor's office, but inside the gray walls of Clinton prison. Because even in defeat, Lucky Luciano wasn't done playing the game. His empire might have been shaken, but it wasn't destroyed. The trial had ended one chapter of his life, but inside those prison walls, a new kind of power was waiting to be born. Clinton Correctional Facility, a name that inspired dread even among hardened criminals. Perched in the cold reaches of upstate New York, it was known as Little Siberia, a fortress of concrete and snow where men vanished into monotony and madness. But when Charles Lucky Luciano arrived there in 1936, it wasn't fear that filled the air, it was curiosity. Guards, inmates, even wardens had heard the stories. The man who ruled New York's underworld was now a prisoner among thieves and killers. They wanted to see if the myth could survive the walls. Luciano entered the prison system as inmate number 92168, but everyone knew he wasn't ordinary. Even stripped of his suits, stripped of his fortune, stripped of his freedom, he carried himself with quiet authority. He didn't shout, didn't posture. He observed. He adapted. In the world of organized crime, power came from control, and prison, Luciano quickly realized, was just another system waiting to be organized. At first he kept his distance. Clinton was brutal, overcrowded, underheated, ruled by violence and boredom. Inmates fought over scraps, guards ruled through humiliation. But within months, subtle shifts began to occur. Cigarettes, candy, and favors started to circulate. Certain guards became friendlier. New inmates seemed to find work assignments that suited them. Order, of a different kind, began to take shape, an invisible network, quiet but efficient. Luciano was rebuilding what he knew best, a system of loyalty and exchange. His influence spread not through intimidation but through psychology. He understood what every man in prison wanted: comfort, protection, respect. To some, he offered advice. To others, connections. Even the guards weren't immune. Small gestures, polite words, and discreet payments ensured Luciano enjoyed certain privileges. He had his own cell, access to books, even a radio. Within a year, the boss of bosses was once again living by his own rules, even behind bars. But Luciano's power wasn't just about comfort, it was strategic. He maintained contact with the outside world through coded letters and visiting intermediaries. His trusted associates, Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky, and Joe Adonis, visited frequently under the guise of family or business discussions. The prison warden knew, of course, but preferred not to interfere. Luciano wasn't causing trouble. In fact, he kept the peace. Even in confinement, he exuded control. Costello became the public face of Luciano's empire, ensuring the gambling networks ran smoothly. Lansky handled the finances, investing in legitimate ventures while maintaining ties to Cuba and Florida. The commission, Luciano's brainchild, continued to meet in secret, ensuring that the machinery of organized crime never stopped turning. Luciano might have been physically trapped, but his ideas, his system, still ruled the streets. What's remarkable is that he never lost his strategic clarity. Prison for him was time to reflect, to think, to plan the next move. He began to see patterns in history, to understand how empires, even criminal ones, needed reinvention. He once told a guard, half in jest, Every king needs exile. It clears the mind. Those who met him during those years described a man utterly at peace with his reality. He read philosophy, biographies, law. He studied systems of governance, not to reform but to perfect his own understanding of power. And yet, beneath the calm, the humiliation lingered. He missed the rhythm of New York, the late-night meetings, the smell of cigars and money. The prison's silence was alien. To cope, he built routine, waking early, exercising, reading. It wasn't discipline for health, it was discipline for survival. Luciano knew that to lose control of oneself was to lose everything. Over the years, his relationship with Dewey, the man who had put him there, evolved in curious ways. When Dewey became governor of New York in 1943, he was no longer just the ambitious prosecutor who had crushed the Mafia's prince. He was a politician with greater ambitions, and in that shifting balance of power, Luciano saw an opening. That same year, World War II was raging. German submarines stalked the East Coast, sinking merchant ships and threatening supply lines. The U.S. government needed help, and they turned quietly to the underworld. Through naval intelligence, an agreement was made. The Mafia would help secure the docks, protect shipping routes, and gather intelligence through their contacts in Sicily. Who could make that happen better than Lucky Luciano? It was ironic, poetic even. The same man who had been condemned as the embodiment of corruption was now being asked indirectly to serve his country. From his cell in Dannemora, Luciano approved the arrangement through intermediaries. He had the connections, the loyalty, and the influence to make it happen. The operation, later known as Operation Underworld, became one of the strangest alliances in American history, the government and the Mafia working together against a common enemy. For Luciano, it was redemption, not moral but strategic. He had something the state needed, and that made him valuable again. Prison no longer felt like a dead end, it felt like a waiting room for a new opportunity. By 1945, the results of Operation Underworld gave Dewey political cover to reconsider Luciano's fate. Quiet negotiations began between the governor's office, naval intelligence, and Luciano's lawyers. The deal was simple. In exchange for his cooperation and continued silence, Luciano's sentence would be commuted, but with one condition. He would have to leave America permanently. And so, from within the gray confines of Clinton Prison, the man once branded as America's most dangerous criminal began orchestrating his freedom. Not through violence, not through escape, but through influence, the same quiet, relentless influence that had always defined him. In that cold cell, Lucky Luciano proved one final truth about power. Real authority doesn't vanish when the walls close in, it simply adapts. Even behind bars, he remained what he had always been. The man who saw systems where others saw chaos and opportunity where others saw endings. After his release from prison in 1946, Lucky Luciano's life entered its final act. One filled with exile, reflection, and the quiet echo of lost power. The man who had once ruled New York's criminal empire now found himself standing on foreign soil, a stranger in his own homeland. Deported to Italy as part of a political deal, Luciano was forced to leave behind the city that had made him, and the empire that had defined him. Naples became his reluctant refuge. There, amid the noise of the port and the bustle of black market trade, Luciano tried to rebuild some semblance of control. He was still respected, even feared, but no longer in command. The world had changed, the Mafia had evolved without him. His name still carried weight, yet the throne he had once held was now occupied by younger, more reckless men who lacked his discipline. In exile, Luciano sought relevance through new ventures. The post-war drug trade, the smuggling networks linking Sicily and America. Authorities suspected his hand in every major narcotics deal that crossed the Atlantic, but they could never prove it. He moved cautiously, aware that one mistake could bring everything crashing down again. His influence was more ghost than presence. Subtle, indirect, but still powerful enough to make governments nervous. Yet behind the facade of control, Luciano was aging. Friends described him as restless, reflective, even lonely. The power that had once defined him now seemed hollow. In interviews he spoke less about money or crime and more about respect, about wanting to be remembered not as a gangster, but as a man who brought peace to the underworld. It was as if he sought redemption, not from the law, but from history itself. His final years were spent between small apartments, quiet dinners, and occasional meetings with filmmakers and journalists fascinated by his legend. On January 26, 1962, moments after greeting a producer who wanted to make a movie about his life, Luciano collapsed and died of a heart attack. It was an unceremonious end for a man who once controlled the streets. But perhaps in that simplicity there was truth. the architect of the Mafia, undone not by bullets or betrayal but by time itself. When Lucky Luciano died in 1962, his passing marked more than the end of a man's life, it marked the closing of an era. The newspapers called him the father of modern organized crime, a title that was both an accusation and a tribute. In death, he became something larger than life. A myth, a symbol of how intellect and ruthlessness could reshape even the darkest corners of society. Luciano's greatest legacy was not the power he held, but the structure he left behind. Before him, gangs fought like tribes, driven by emotion, pride, and chaos. After him, the Mafia became an institution, operating like a corporation with hierarchies, rules, and strategy. His creation of the commission ensured that the five families of New York, once at each other's throats, could coexist, negotiate, and profit together. It was organized crime turned into organized business. But his influence reached far beyond New York. The system he built became the blueprint for organized crime across the United States and even overseas. From Havana's casinos to Sicilian heroin routes, his fingerprints were everywhere. The Mafia became international, more coordinated, more sophisticated, and that evolution began with Luciano's vision. Even after his deportation and death, the men who followed, Lansky, Costello, Genovese, all operated within the framework he designed. Culturally, he became the archetype of the modern gangster, intelligent, composed, and dangerously charming. Hollywood turned him into legend. Books and films borrowed his style, his methods, even his moral ambiguity. To the public, Luciano became less a criminal and more an icon, a man who made crime look like business and business look like art. Yet beneath the myth lies a moral contradiction. Luciano sought order but built it through fear. He wanted peace but enforced it with violence. His empire brought stability but at the cost of human life and freedom. That duality, brilliance and brutality intertwined, is what makes his legacy so haunting. Lucky Luciano's true impact wasn't just on the Mafia. It was on the psychology of power itself, showing the world how control, loyalty, and profit could merge into one unstoppable force. He didn't just build an empire, he built a model that outlasted him. Lucky Luciano's story ends not with a violent blaze, but with quiet inevitability. A man whose heart finally gave out after decades of defying fate. By the time he died in 1962, he was no longer the feared king of New York's underworld, but a shadow of his former self, exiled, aging, and haunted by the empire he had created. Yet even in death, his influence refused to fade. He had reshaped the very definition of organized crime, turning chaos into structure, violence into business, and loyalty into currency. Luciano's true genius lay in understanding people, their greed, fear, and need for belonging. He built a system that exploited all three, creating order where there had once been only street warfare. The commission, his greatest invention, ensured that no single family could dominate unchecked. It was part democracy, part dictatorship, a structure that mirrored corporate America as much as it did the criminal underworld. But this brilliance came at a cost. The order he created depended on silence, fear, and betrayal. The same system that made the Mafia efficient also made it inhuman. In trying to control chaos, Luciano built a machine that consumed everything, including him. His empire outlived him, but without his balance of intellect and pragmatism, it soon crumbled into greed and violence. Today his name stands at the crossroads of myth and morality. To some, he was a visionary, the man who brought logic to lawlessness. To others, he was a symbol of corruption's seductive power. The truth lies somewhere between. Luciano was neither hero nor monster, but something far more human, ambitious, calculating, and unrelentingly driven by survival. In the end, his life reminds us that power, even when organized and rationalized, remains a dangerous illusion. Lucky Luciano didn't just build the Mafia, he built a mirror that still reflects our fascination with control, ambition, and the thin line between order and corruption.